Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be telling you about my reading goals for 2025. Before anything else, I do have a bit of a cold and I feel like my voice is slightly going. It's hard to judge because it sounds worse to me than I think it probably does on camera, but maybe I will edit this video and realise that my voice is slowly vanishing. But here we go. Regardless, I am excited to talk about my 2025 reading goals today. I also just wanted to say as well, before I get into all the goals, thank you for, watching my channel for another year and sticking around. It's always really, really lovely to see lots of people in the comments. If you ever want to support this channel, I will leave more information down below about my Patreon, where I have a couple of different tiers. One is a sort of tip jar thing, one is regular weekly Friday Reads videos, and one is a historical fiction book club. And if you ever want to leave me a tip on Super Thanks, that would be very, very lovely and very, very appreciated. No pressure as ever. That kind of support allows me to spend more time on my booktube videos, but there will be booktube videos here regardless. But I often forget to mention these things, and a goals video for the coming year seemed like a good place. I also have a couple of affiliate links for bookshops. So I have an affiliate link for Blackwell's and also for bookshop.org.uk. So Blackwell's is a bookshop here in the UK, but they also deliver to the US. And I know quite a lot of people in the US who buy UK editions of books use Blackwell's, and I got an affiliate link for them fairly recently, so I'll leave that link down below. And if you ever are going to buy a book from Blackwell's anyway, and you want to buy it through my link and give me a tiny bit of commission, that would be very, very nice. And I also have an affiliate link for bookshop.org.uk, which is a UK website where you can support local independent bookshops by buying online. And again, if you're ever going to buy a book from there anyway, and you would like to use my affiliate link and then I will get some commission, that would be very nice. So I'll leave those things down below, but I thought I'd mention them here, and then I probably won't mention them again for several months. So one other thing I did want to talk about before I get into my specific reading goals was kind of like reading goals as a thing, because I know that a lot of people don't like them or find them stressful, and I feel like everyone has a different kind of like feeling about goals and resolutions and that kind of thing. And I feel like I often have quite ambitious reading goals, and I have, my ridiculous goal spreadsheet kind of thing, which I think for some people would feel like putting a lot of pressure on yourself. For me, reading goals, one, they're really fun, and they're a fun way of like gamifying my reading in a way that I really enjoy. I love a good spreadsheet and a good list and that kind of thing. So it's really fun for me to have reading goals like this, but also like I'm not very good at relaxing, which is not necessarily the best combination with working freelance, because when you work freelance, you could kind of always be doing more work. So in a way, having ambitious reading goals is like giving myself permission to relax and read a lot. In a way, I feel like if I didn't have any reading goals, I would read less and I would relax less and I would have less fun reading. So reading goals for me are like a really good way of part of myself justifying to another part of myself my right to sit down and read for ages, which is very silly, but does work. And I do spend a lot of time reading, so there we go. Anyway, that was a long preamble before any reading goals. But let me get into my reading goals. So my reading goals for 2025 are a bit more focused than my reading goals in previous years. I was thinking about my reading goals for 2024 and 2023, and I feel like I often have the same goals every year. And this year I want to think a bit more carefully about which reading goals are just like fun gamifying things and which reading goals are like things that matter to me more. So I think for 2025 I've gone for sort of fewer goals that I care more about achieving. I still have a big spreadsheet, but I have a clearer idea of what my focuses are for 2025, I suppose. So usually every year I talk about like my Goodreads challenge in my reading goals videos, but I don't really think there's any point in doing that, because I basically set my Goodreads challenge for 100 books every year, and I basically always read more than 100 books every year, and I wouldn't mind if I didn't, so that's not really a goal, is it? I still set my Goodreads challenge at 100 books, but that isn't really a goal. We don't need to worry about that here. Let's talk about my actual first proper goal for 2025, and that is about my physical TBR and reducing the books that have been on it for ages. Every year on Books and Things for many, many years, I say at the beginning of the year that I want to get my physical TBR down and that I want to reduce the amount of titles in my TBR jar. And basically every year I don't get my physical TBR down as much as I would like to. But basically every year my TBR is at a pretty similar level. Like I feel like my TBR is just forever between 40 and 60 books. Sometimes maybe it gets down to 30, sometimes it might get up to 70, but it basically lives around the 40 to 60 book mark. And that is fine. Like as someone who reads maybe 150 books a year, 50 of which are audiobooks, say, so as someone who reads 100 physical books a year, to have 40 to 60 physical books on my TBR at any one time seems kind of right. So I think I'm going to stop worrying about the size of my overall TBR, and I'm not going to set myself an aim of what I want my TBR to be at the end of 2025. I don't want it to be really more than 60 books. Like at the moment it's 62 books, I think, but I got quite a lot of books for Christmas, and have bought some books with Christmas vouchers and money and stuff. So before Christmas it was at like 47. So, you know, it's still in kind of the vague right area. I don't want my TBR to go out of control, but nor am I going to make a really conscious effort to get my TBR down to like under however many books this year. If I finish the year with my TBR between 40 and 60 books, then that is about right. However, what I don't like about my physical TBR is that there are quite a few books that have been on there for a really, really long time. And it was interesting, I was looking at my physical TBR and all the books on it, and I think basically what I mostly have is books that I have owned for less than 6 months, and books that I've owned for like more than a year, often for more than a year and a half. Like actually a lot of books, the majority of books come onto my TBR and I read them within a year, and that is how I would like that to be. But there are definitely books on my TBR that have been there for a long time and just continue to sit there, and I continue to not read them. And I would like to read those books. So here I have my physical TBR jar. I have used the TBR jar, well, TBR bucket really, for many years. This contains on it a list of various titles. And usually what I do is refresh my TBR jar just before Christmas every year. So it contains in it all the books I've owned from before Christmas that year. And then I don't update it during the year, but I just try and read the books I've owned sort of for a slightly longer period of time, rather than just reading the books that are newly coming onto my TBR. But basically what I think I do a lot with my TBR jar is top it up in December of a year with books that I have acquired that year, and then proceed to read all the books I have acquired that year and not read the books that I owned before then that were already in the TBR jar, which is a very long-winded way of me saying I'm not going to be topping up my TBR jar this year. So within this TBR jar / bucket there are the names of 19 books. So they are the 19 books that have been on my TBR for the longest, the 19 books on my TBR that I have owned since before Christmas 2023. There is one other book on my TBR that I've owned since before Christmas 2023, but I got that book with the specific intention of reading it because it was thematically related to a novel that I was going to write, and then I've decided to write a different novel first instead. So depending on when I write that novel, I will then read that book, but I don't want to read it before I'm starting to write that novel. You didn't need to know that, did you? There are 19 titles in this jar of books that have been on my TBR for more than a year, and I would like to read all 19 of them this year. I have even put them on their own shelf. So I got a new like little side table thing for my office, my library, the room that I work in. It has a little bookshelf beneath it. So I have put those books on that table. And I want to read them all this year. Like not 10 of them, not 50 of them. I want to read all 19 in 2025 because these are books that I have owned for more than a year, that I want to read, that I haven't yet read and I should have read. And I think by really focusing my TBR jar challenge and my like overall TBR challenge onto reading those 19 books that I've had for ages, I think that will be good, and I think that will rebalance my TBR in the way I want it to be, because I don't mind if a book sits on my TBR for 6 months or 2 months, but I do mind if a book sits on there for a year plus and I don't read it. And I think also having separated out my like short-term and long-term TBR into 2 separate piles means that unless I have a specific reason for reading another book that I physically own, whether that is for a book club or because it's a review copy that I need to read before it's published, or it's from a particular genre that I'm focusing on this month or whatever for a read-along, or just from my own project, whatever. Unless I have a specific reason for reading one of the books from the other bit of my TBR, which is on a different shelf, then I will pick a book from those 19 books in my TBR jar. And I think that will be a better way of managing my TBR in the way I want to in 2025. That's like a key goal for this year, and that feels manageable. Like 19 books is not very many books. I read a lot of books. That should be fine. Basically, my plan is to clear out my TBR of the books that have been on it for a very long time. And then I feel like I will be happier with my TBR at the size and level it's at. So my second goal for 2025 is Victorian literature related. And the main section of this goal is to finish reading all of the works of Anthony Trollope. This is another very major goal for 2025. I think it's very doable. I'm very excited about it. So at the start of 2025, I had 9 novels left to read by Anthony Trollope. I have actually just finished one yesterday, but you know, that's fine. 9 novels left to read by Anthony Trollope out of his 47 novels. There's also a short story collection I own by him that I want to read. I also want to read his autobiography, and there are also 2 of his novels that I want to reread in 2025. 2 of his books, Rachel Ray and He Knew He Was Right, that I read a really, really long time ago and don't remember very well and want to reread before I consider myself having completed all of Anthony Trollope's books. So that means there are 13 books by Anthony Trollope I want to read in 2025, just over 1 a month. But as I said, I finished one of them in the first 4 days of 2025. So basically 1 a month for the rest of the year. And that's very exciting. This is a really big goal for the year. I love Anthony Trollope. He's one of my absolute favourite authors, like my top authors ever. Charles Dickens is number 1, and then it's like Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell and Anthony Trollope having a fight for second place, and they're all so good. And Anthony Trollope is such a wonderful author, and he wrote 47 novels, and I've so nearly read all of them, and I'm really excited to continue and read all of them. I've got a few buddy reads planned for some Anthony Trollope books, and if there's anyone else out there who's reading their way through Trollope and wants to do a buddy read, let me know. I will leave a list in the description of the books by him I still have to read, and I will also leave down below a kind of Trollope check-in I did at some point towards the end of 2024, talking about my reading plans for 2025. I also have here a Anthony Trollope TBR jar, so if I don't know which Anthony Trollope book to read next, I can just take a name out the jar and read, you know, the Bertrams. This is my biggest goal in 2025 when it comes to Victorian literature. However, I do also have my long-term Victorian literature TBR video list that I made in 2023, like late 2023, with a list of 35 books that I wanted to read across 2024 and 2025. I basically accepted that I'm not going to read all of them by the end of 2025, and I really don't mind that. I think I'll keep that list onto 2026 and 2027, but I do want to keep working my way through those books because that is a list of Victorian books that I'm really interested in, and I made myself a Victorian literature TBR jar, so if I don't know what Victorian book to read next, I can just pick a title out of this jar and that'll be the one I read next. So I'm hoping that I will maybe pick a Victorian book out of this TBR jar every month, maybe every other month. So I think this will be a fun extra thing for 2025, but this is definitely taking a big backseat to the Anthony Trollope challenge. Then my third reading challenge for 2025, which is a big challenge and one that I really want to prioritise this year, is to read more internationally. So this is one of my kind of main goals for this year, and when I get onto my goal spreadsheet later, you will kind of see that reflected in the goal spreadsheet. But basically, I would like to read more from different countries and more in translation. I feel like I say this every year and then don't do it as much as I would like to. But this year, I really want to make it a bigger priority and a bigger goal. I'm also hoping to take part in aspects of Katja from Page Turners with Katja's Reading the Globe challenge. Basically, Katja's doing this really cool reading challenge for the whole of 2025, all about reading books from around the world. And there are 3 strands. So there's a contemporary strand, a YA middle grade strand, and a classic strand. I want to read all the books in the classic strand, and then I want to try and read some books from the other 2 strands as well. I'll leave lots more information down below about that. But I think that'll be a really good way of guiding some of my international reading in 2025. But beyond that as well, I want to make this a bigger priority for this year. So I want to try and read books from authors from more than 30 different countries. In 2024, I read books by authors from, I think, 24 different countries, and I want to go broader and wider and read from a wider variety of countries. And I would also like to aim for 20% of my reading to be in translation. Now, I think that reading from authors from 30 different countries is achievable. I hope to achieve that. I don't actually think it is realistic or likely that I will get to 20% of my reading in translation. I think the amount of my reading in translation in 2024 was like 8%, but I think if I set my goal at 20%, I will get closer to it. That's a like ambitious stretch goal, but I would like to try. I'm really excited for some of the books I'm going to be reading for Katja's Reading the Globe challenge. And in general, I just want to read more from different places in the world because I find that really interesting. And especially when it comes to classics. Obviously, I'm always going to read a lot of books from 19th century Britain because that's the time period I really know and I'm really kind of interested in. That's sort of my specialism, as it were. But I feel like whenever I read a classic from another country, I just like learn something small and interesting about that country's history in a way that I really love. And, you know, when I was looking back on my International Classics Challenge over the last few years, like so many of my favourite books the last few years have been books I read for that challenge. And I just want to push myself to read more from around the world, especially for classics, but for contemporary literature too. So those are my 3 main reading goals for 2025, more focused than in previous years and hopefully all achievable or nearly achievable. Read those 19 books that have been on my TBR for ages, finish reading all of Anthony Trollope's novels, and read more internationally. But another kind of related goal I have to that is not about book reading so much as like book buying and what books I buy, and that is to be more careful about the books I acquire and try and curate my TBR more. One of the reasons why, for example, I don't read as internationally as I would like to is because my physical TBR is always really dominated by British literature, and usually by like British new releases of historical fiction, which I love to read and I will continue to read plenty of. But that means that like my efforts to keep my TBR under control are kind of always in conflict with my efforts to read more internationally. So what I want to do in 2025 is try and like limit and think more carefully about the books I am acquiring. So buying books at like book launches or events are always fine because I go to some book launches. Like that's part of being an author and that's really, really fun. And I don't want to not buy the books of authors I've gone to support at their book launches. Likewise, accepting proof copies for review or for endorsement is also fine. Like that is also kind of part of being an author that I wouldn't want to neglect. And in general, I'm relatively good at saying no to proof copies if I have too many proof copies that I haven't yet read. But beyond like proof copies that I'm being sent for free or buying books at book launches and events, when it comes to books I'm buying kind of in bookshops, I basically just want to be buying international and translated literature. I think that will really help support my Reading More Internationally challenge in a way that like usually my TBR doesn't, if that makes sense. Okay, but I also have a spreadsheet because of course I have a spreadsheet. If you've been watching Books and Things for any length of time, you will have probably seen one of my crazy goal spreadsheets before. It has a lot of tick boxes on. I'm not expecting to tick all of these boxes off, and that is fine, but I will put the goal spreadsheet on the screen anyway for you to have a look at. In some ways, my reading goal spreadsheet is quite similar to how it was in 2024, but there are some differences. There are a similar amount of checkboxes. I think I had 267 checkboxes in 2024, and I have 260 for 2025, so very similar. As I always say when I do these goal spreadsheets, I'm not intending to read 260 books in 2025. The one book might tick off multiple prompts. You know, if I read a book that was a work of science fiction or fantasy by an author who was not from the UK, that had come out in 2025 and was part of a series, I would tick off 4 boxes. I probably won't read a book that ticks off 4 boxes, but I will probably read several books that tick off 2 or 3. As you will also see, I have put my like main goals of the year on my goals spreadsheet as well to remind me of them. So as you can see, for Victorian classics, we have 13 slots for Anthony Trollope because, as I said, there are 13 books by Anthony Trollope I want to read in 2025. I've already read one, so I'm doing pretty well, and I'm very excited to tick off all of those boxes. I'm very determined to tick off all of those boxes in 2025. I've also put 4 boxes for Victorian rereads, not counting the 2 Anthony Trollope books I want to reread. They'll go in the Trollope section. If I don't reread 4 Victorian books in 2025, that's fine. It's mostly just to keep the rereads out of the main section of the challenge, if that makes sense. And then I have 18 boxes for Victorian books that are not by Anthony Trollope. Considering I probably read, 10 or so Victorian books in Victober, 18 seems pretty doable to me. For my British non-Victorian classics, I feel like I have kept my challenge very similar to last year. I'd like to try and read 10 books published between 1900 and 1950. I'd like to try and read 8 books published before 1837. I'd like to read 4 books published from sort of 1950 to 1990, but To be honest, I basically feel like I will tick off most of these goals without trying. This reflects my reading of British classics that aren't from the Victorian period, so that's fine by me. That stays the same as last year. But when it comes to my international classics, I have slightly changed the challenge this year. So as I said, I really want to read from a wider variety of countries in 2025. So I'm doing my international classics challenge slightly differently. So previously, for the last 4 years, I've picked 3 countries a year and tried to read a few classics from those countries, which I've really enjoyed doing, and I probably will do again. But this year, I'm going to try and read a classic from 18 different countries. So as you will see, there's kind of 18 boxes for classics from different countries, and then there are 8 check boxes for classics from repeat countries, because, you know, I'll probably read more than one French classic in 2025, and I want to separate out a book I'm reading from a new to me country, or a new to me for this year country, to a book that I'm reading from a country that I read from more often. My plan is to try and read a lot of different classics from a lot of different countries in 2025. I think this will be really fun and really interesting. Please do let me know your recommendations for classics from around the world, especially for classics by women and for classics from before the 20th century, because I feel like whenever I read classics from around the world, I often end up reading classics by men from the 20th century. And, you know, many of them are fantastic, but I would like to try and have a bit more variation in 2025. I do have a big list already of like various books I'm thinking about, and I'm gonna have a look at what's at my library and what I want to acquire and that kind of thing. But any recommendations, do please let me know. Moving down onto my modern literature goals. When it comes to modern historical fiction, this looks pretty similar to last year, but I have extended, I think, both my like general modern historical fiction and my historical crime mystery goals. Basically, I have upped my historical fiction target to like the same amount of books as my Victorian literature target, because that seems right to me. Like, those are the 2 things I read the most of, Victorian literature and, you know, historical fiction published in the last few years. And I also wanted to have a few more slots for historical crime and mysteries or thrillers, because I have been really enjoying reading historical murder mysteries lately, so I want to continue doing that into 2025. Moving on to my sort of modern other fiction category, I have extended a few areas this year. So I've said I want to read 7 rom-coms, 7 contemporary crime thriller mystery books, 7 sci-fi or fantasy books, and 7 other books, which I guess would be like literary fiction, general fiction, maybe middle grade or YA if it didn't fit into another category. I think 3 out of 4 bits of this challenge will be very, very achievable, but reading 7 works of fantasy or science fiction in 2025 is a bigger stretch. I only read 1 work of science fiction or fantasy in 2025, and that was The Mars House by Natasha Pulley, who usually writes historical fiction. So even that, like, I didn't pick up purposely because I was looking to read science fiction and fantasy. And it feels like such a shame to me that I read barely any in 2025, because I love science fiction and fantasy so much. And there are several sci-fi and fantasy books which I would rate among my kind of favourite books of all time. I think basically I end up not reaching for science fiction or fantasy very often, because they're often long books and they're often books in long series, so it feels like a big commitment. But I really want to try and read some more science fiction and fantasy in 2025, and I was thinking, as in 2025 I will not be rereading a lot of very long Dickens books on audiobook as I was in 2023 and 2024, I'm hoping to use some of that like audiobook time to read some science fiction and fantasy books. Specifically, there are several series that I have started and loved, and not read on with in this area. So the Imperial Arch trilogy by Anne Leckie, I read Ancillary Justice like a decade ago, loved it. Never read anything else in the series, but my husband Nick has been reading them lately, so I think I would like to reread Ancillary Justice and then carry on with the series. There's also the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers. I love The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet and The Closed and Common Orbit, but I think it's been about 4 or 5 years since I last read a book in that series, so I want to carry on with that series. There's also the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. I read and loved the first 2 in the series, Assassin's Apprentice and Royal Assassin, and I think it probably is about 2 years since I read Royal Assassin, and I still haven't read Assassin's Quest, so I really need to read that. And then I also really want to read on with the Ending Fire series by Sarah El-Arifi. I read and absolutely loved The Final Strife in 2022. Like, genuinely, I think about that book all the time. maybe my favourite fantasy book I've ever read. And there are 2 other books out in the series, The Battle of the Drum and The Ending Fire, that I still haven't read. So I need to do that in 2025. Moving down in my goal spreadsheet, next we have modern international literature. And again, I want to try and read from a wider variety of countries in 2025 and read more internationally in general. So here I have 13 slots for new countries or, you know, different countries. Each checkbox needs to be taken up with a different country. And then I have 13 slots for repeat countries. Basically, I was thinking about whether I want to prioritize, you know, reading internationally in terms of contemporary literature or reading internationally in terms of classics. And I think I want to prioritize reading internationally in terms of classics. So I have made the challenge a bit easier for the modern literature. I also know that I'm likely to read quite a lot of books from around the world that are repeat countries. You know, most years I read several books from Japan, the USA, Ireland, Australia, etc. But I do want to try and make sure I'm reading from lots of different countries as well. As I said, reading more internationally is a big priority for 2025. I feel like I have much less of an idea of what books I might read for this, and less of a list of books I might read for this. So if you have any recommendations of relatively new books from around the world, do please let me know. Then the next part of my goal spreadsheet is for 2025/2026 releases. Probably not going to be reading very many 2026 new releases, but come November, December, I might be reading some new 2026 releases that are coming out in the following year, so I like to just include both years. But anyway, I like to have this kind of new releases goal every year, partly to make sure I'm kind of keeping up with the market, because working as an author and an editor, that is something that is useful and important for me to do. But also I think it helps me kind of keep on top of the review copies I've been sent by publishers. I don't think this will be a huge challenge, and that is fine. So those are the classic goals and the modern literature goals, and now we move on to the kind of general goals. The checkboxes in these goals can be ticked off either by classics or by contemporary books. And first up we have my kind of not a novel challenge, which now has so many rows I'm not sure how I'm going to fit it on the screen, but anyway, so I said I want to read 5 comics or graphic novels in 2025. I read a superhero comic for the first time in 2024, a Hawk Girl comic, and I really, really enjoyed it. So I definitely want to read more comics in 2025. Then I've said I want to read 10 works of non-fiction, 10 plays, 10 works of poetry, and 10 short story collections. That seems relatively doable to me. I've made my not a novel goals slightly less ambitious in 2025 than 2024, but I don't think I will have a huge problem ticking off at least the majority of these boxes. Then next I have a new category, a new row on my goal spreadsheet, and that is that I would like to read 12 books that are from series. As I said when I was talking about science fiction and fantasy, there are several series that I have started, sometimes started quite a long time ago, that I haven't finished, that I would like to finish. So in a way, this new row on my goal spreadsheet is partly a way to like doubly encourage me to read more science fiction and fantasy in 2025, because if I read any of those books from those 4 series I was talking about, they'll count for 2 goals on my spreadsheet. But also there are some crime and mystery series, especially historical crime and mystery series that I've started that I want to continue with in 2025. And there are also some classic series that I want to continue with. You know, I'm still working my way through Agatha Christie's Poirot books. I have one more book to read in Margaret Oliphant's Carlingford Chronicles. I want to make more progress with Susan Cooper's children's classic series, The Dark is Rising. And I would kind of like to start reading the Lord of the Rings series in 2025, because I have never read The Lord of the Rings. Considering how much I like the films, I feel like I definitely should have read the books. Then finally, the last bit of my goal spreadsheet is my TBR jar pick. And here I have 19 boxes for the 19 books that have been in my TBR for longer than a year. And I want to tick off all of these boxes. This is very important to me. Will I achieve it in 2025? I feel like I should be able to. So let's do this. I have many goals for 2025, but there are a few like real focus ones. Finish reading all of Anthony Trollope's books, read more internationally, get through those 19 books that have been in my TBR for too long. I'm excited to read many good things in 2025, and I hope you are too. Do let me know down in the comments, do you have any reading goals for 2025, and what are they? What are you looking forward to in your reading life in the next year? That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.